Welcome to Soothing Stories. Tonight, settle in and let the world outside grow quiet. This is a story about the 100 Years' War between England and France. There is nothing you need to do now but listen and breathe. Let the words carry you gently into rest. The river is wide here and slow, and the color of pewter in the failing light. On both banks the willows have given themselves over to the evening, their long fingers trailing in the water, their reflections rippling gently each time a fish rises to the surface and then is gone. The fields beyond the willows are the deep, saturated green of northern France in autumn, the green of a land that has had a great deal of rain and has accepted it without complaint, that has grown thick and lush and heavy with it, that keeps its color long after the light begins to fail. A road runs along the far bank, a muddy track worn pale by centuries of feet, and it disappears into a stand of oaks whose leaves have turned to bronze and amber, trembling a little now in the first breath of the evening wind. The sky above them is enormous. Great castles of cloud, pink-bellied and soft at their edges, sail slowly eastward over the flat country. A heron stands motionless in the shallows, as herons do, as herons always have, patient beyond any human capacity for patience, waiting for something it is entirely certain will come. Tonight we will walk slowly through one of the longest and most consequential conflicts in the history of medieval Europe, the war between England and France that stretched, in one form or another, across more than 100 years of the 14th and 15th centuries, and that shaped the very idea of what those two nations were and what they would become. It was a war that produced some of the most extraordinary characters the medieval world ever made. Warrior kings and visionary saints, cunning diplomats and betrayed princes, ordinary archers from the English shires who found themselves standing in fields far from home, and French peasant girls who heard voices in the light and led armies before they were out of their teens. Let the river settle beside you. Let the evening come on. We are in no hurry. There is only this long and human story, and the quiet of the dusk, and the heron, still and perfect in the shallows. To understand where the war came from, you have to go back to a world that looked almost nothing like the world we know. A world in which the boundaries between kingdoms were not lines on a map but webs of personal obligation, of oath and blood and inherited claim, of marriages arranged in smoky great halls between men who had never met the women they were promising their sons to. In this world, loyalty was owed not to an abstraction called France or England, but to a person, to a lord, to a king, to whoever sat at the top of the pyramid of obligation that organized feudal society. And at the very top of that pyramid in France, in the early 14th century, sat the Capetian kings, who had ruled for more than 3 centuries and who had, through a combination of political skill, fortunate marriages, and sheer longevity, built one of the most powerful monarchies in Europe. The trouble began, as so much trouble does, with a question of inheritance. The Capetian king Philip IV, known to his contemporaries as Philip le Bel, Philip the Fair, a name that referred to his appearance rather than his character, for he was by most accounts a cold and formidable man, died in 1314 after a reign of extraordinary ambition and considerable ruthlessness. He had 3 sons, and they followed him onto the throne one by one. And then, one by one, they died without male heirs. The last of them, Charles IV, died in 1328, and with him the direct Capetian line was extinguished after more than 300 years. The throne of France was suddenly, dramatically, empty. And into that vacancy crowded the claims of several interested parties, each with their own case, each with their own supporters, each with their own very clear sense of what they deserved. Among those claimants was a young man of 16 named Edward III of England, who was the grandson of Philip the Fair through his mother Isabella, the French princess who had married the English King Edward II. Edward's claim through his mother was, by the simple logic of blood, a strong one. But France had a tradition, or rather, France's nobles invented a tradition at precisely this convenient moment, that the crown could not pass through the female line. The ancient Salic law, they said, a woman cannot transmit what she cannot herself possess. And so the French magnates passed over Edward and chose instead Philip of Valois, a cousin of Philip the Fair through the male line, who became Philip VI, the first king of the new Valois dynasty. Edward, furious but not yet ready to fight about it, accepted the situation for a time. He even paid homage to Philip for his French territories, the Duchy of Aquitaine in the southwest of France, which English kings had held since Eleanor of Aquitaine had brought it to Henry II as her dowry nearly 2 centuries before. He bent his knee. He said the words, and he waited. Aquitaine was the wound that would never quite heal. English kings had held it fought for it, taxed it, and argued about it for generations. It was rich. Its vineyards produced wine that was the great luxury export of the medieval Atlantic economy. Wine that sailed in barrels up to England and across to the Low Countries and was drunk in the halls of nobles who had never set foot on French soil. But holding Aquitaine as a vassal of the French king was a constant humiliation, a perpetual reminder that the King of England, in his capacity as Duke of Aquitaine, knelt to another king. Every dispute about the borders of the duchy, every French attempt to intervene in its affairs, every summons to the French royal court was both a practical problem and an insult. The two kingdoms were entangled in each other in ways that made genuine peace very difficult and genuine war almost inevitable. The spark, when it came, was provided by Scotland. England and France had long maintained an alliance, the Auld Alliance. The Scots called it with proprietary satisfaction, in which France would support Scottish independence against English pressure, and Scotland in turn would provide England with a difficult northern frontier that required attention and resources. When Edward III moved to crush Scottish resistance and install his own candidate on the Scottish throne, Philip VI, honoring the alliance, gave refuge to the Scottish claimant. Edward responded by denouncing Philip as a false king and declaring himself, in 1337, the rightful king of France. The war had begun, though it would take decades to find its shape, and more than a century to find its end. Let the river hold you here for a moment. The light is nearly gone from the western horizon. Just a thin line of pale gold above the dark mass of the oaks. And the first stars are appearing in the east. Faint and tentative, as though not entirely sure of their welcome. The heron has moved. Sometime in the last few minutes, without your noticing, it is standing now a little further downstream, still motionless, still waiting. The willows whisper in the evening wind. A barge, somewhere on the river beyond the bend, shows a single lantern, its reflection long and wavering in the dark water. The France that Edward III claimed, the France he rode into with his armies in the late 1330s, was a country of astonishing richness and complexity. Thousands of villages, each with its church and its mill and its fields laid out in the open strip system that the medieval world had perfected. Dozens of great towns, walled and proud, their cathedral spires visible from miles away across the flat country. A population of some 15 million people, larger than England's, wealthier in aggregate, more various in its regions and languages and loyalties. The English army that crossed to France was smaller than the French forces arrayed against it, and it looked, to French eyes, like an army that had no particular right to win. It was made up of professional soldiers, knights and men-at-arms of the English nobility, but also, and this was the thing that French commanders consistently underestimated, of large numbers of archers recruited from the shires of England and Wales. These were men of modest social standing, farmers and craftsmen who had trained since boyhood with the longbow, the great weapon of the English and Welsh military tradition, and who could loose an arrow every 5 seconds with sufficient force to punch through the plate armor of a mounted knight at 200 yards. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, on a ridge in northern France on a warm August afternoon, Edward III drew up his army in a defensive position and waited for the French forces of Philip VI to attack. What followed was a catastrophe for France. The French cavalry charged again and again into a storm of arrows that no horse and no armor could withstand. Thousands of French knights and soldiers died on that ridge. The English losses were minimal. Crécy announced something new in the world, or rather, it confirmed something that had been suspected at Bannockburn and Morlakes and a handful of other battles where archers and disciplined infantry had proven themselves against the old aristocratic certainties of the mounted charge. The age of chivalry was not over. Not yet. Not by a long way. It would continue to shape the way people imagined warfare and honor for another century and more, but it had received a serious wound on that August ridge, and the wound would not fully close. The knights of France would charge again and again over the course of this war. At Poitiers and Agincourt and a dozen lesser engagements, and they would be defeated again and again by the same combination of disciplined archers and terrain chosen with care. And each time it happened, there was a quality of shocked incomprehension in the French accounts, as though the natural order of the world had been violated, as though something fundamentally wrong had occurred. The English victory at Crécy was followed, the next year, by the capture of Calais, the great port on the northern coast of France that controlled the narrowest crossing of the Channel. Calais was taken after a long siege, a siege during which the people of the city endured starvation with a stubbornness that Edward eventually rewarded with a famous act of clemency, sparing the lives of the 6 leading citizens who had offered themselves for execution in exchange for the city's survival, their necks in nooses, barefoot, in what became one of the iconic images of medieval courage. Calais would remain in English hands for more than 2 centuries, a foothold in France, a staging point for further campaigns, a source of enormous commercial advantage to English merchants who controlled the wool trade that flowed through its customs house. It was a prize worth almost any cost of blood. And then, in 1348, the war stopped, not from any diplomatic resolution, not from exhaustion, but because something arrived in Europe that made the ambitions of kings seem, for a time, entirely irrelevant. The plague, the pestilence, the Black Death, as later centuries would call it, a pandemic of bubonic and pneumonic plague that arrived from Central Asia along the trade routes and swept through Europe with a speed and thoroughness that no living person had ever witnessed or imagined. Killed, in the space of 2 or 3 years, somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population of Europe. In France, the losses were catastrophic.
Village anti-d'Auvergnat.
Towns were half depopulated. The harvests rotted in the fields because there were not enough people to bring them in. The priests who administered last rites died themselves, and the gravediggers died, and the people who burned the bodies died. And in many places the dead were simply left where they fell or thrown into mass pits without ceremony, without prayer, without the rituals that medieval Christianity required for a good death and a safe passage. The war, in the face of all this dying, paused. Edward III and Philip VI signed truces and let the killing that required human intention rest for a time, while the killing that required none proceeded with its own terrible efficiency. When the plague had passed, when Europe had counted its dead and buried as many of them as could be found and tried to understand what it meant that God had permitted this to happen, the world that resumed was different from the world that had stopped. There were fewer people everywhere. Land was cheap. Labor was expensive. The survivors found themselves, many of them, in a paradoxically better material position than before. There was more land available, more food per person, more opportunity for social mobility among those who had not been carried away. But there was also a psychological wound that the surviving accounts cannot quite articulate, but that is present in them anyway. A quality of stunned disorientation. A sense that the old certainties had been revealed as fragile, as not guaranteed, as dependent on conditions that could change without warning. The war resumed. It always resumed. In 1356, at the Battle of Poitiers, the English and their Gascon allies under Edward III's eldest son, Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, a soldier of extraordinary ability and considerable ferocity, defeated a French army and captured the French king himself. John II, John the Good. Another of those ironic medieval epithets. Since John was a courageous man but not always a wise one, was taken from the field of Poitiers and brought to England as a prisoner of enormous value, and the ransom negotiations that followed stretched across years and produced the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, by which England received a massively expanded Aquitaine and an enormous cash ransom in exchange for not pressing Edward's claim to the French throne. It was the high point of English success in the war. It looked, for a moment, like an ending. It was not an ending. It rarely is. John II was released on condition that hostages remained in England to guarantee payment of his ransom. And when one of those hostages, his son, the Duke of Anjou, broke his parole and escaped back to France, John, in a gesture that astonished his contemporaries and continues to astonish anyone who reads about it, voluntarily returned to captivity in England. He could not in conscience, he said, remain free while his word had been broken by his representative. He went back to London and he died there in 1364, still a prisoner, still a king, having traded his freedom for his honor in a calculation that the chivalric world he lived in understood, even if the modern world finds it strange. There is something in that gesture, something quixotic and magnificent and entirely human, that stays with you. John was succeeded by his son Charles, who was everything his father was not: cautious, methodical, scholarly, possessed of a strategic intelligence that was rare among medieval kings and that earned him the name Charles the Wise. Charles V of France spent the years of his reign quietly rebuilding what Poitiers and the plague had broken, reorganizing the royal finances, reforming the military, and entrusting the actual fighting of the war to a commander of genius.
Bertrand du Guesclin.
A Breton knight of middling birth and unremarkable appearance who had the gift of knowing exactly when not to fight a battle. Du Guesclin avoided the pitched engagements where the English archers had proven so devastating and instead waged a war of attrition, harassing English garrisons, cutting supply lines, retaking towns one by one through siege and negotiation, wearing down English power in France through patience rather than heroism. By the time Charles V died in 1380, English territories in France had been reduced to a narrow coastal strip. The Black Prince was dead. Edward III was dead. The tide had turned so completely that it seemed possible the whole episode would simply conclude in French recovery and English retreat. It did not conclude, because England, in the 1380s and 90s, was consumed by domestic crises, the troubled reign of Richard II, the rising of the peasants in 1381, the factional fighting among the English nobility, and France was similarly distracted by a crisis of a different kind. The madness of Charles VI. Charles VI became King of France in 1380 as a child and was initially a capable ruler. But in 1392 he suffered the first of the episodes of mental illness that would recur throughout his long reign, episodes in which he did not recognize his wife or his children, in which he believed he was made of glass and might shatter if touched, in which he was violent and incoherent and entirely absent from the governance of his kingdom. He lived until 1422 and suffered these episodes repeatedly throughout his reign, and in the gaps between them, he was well enough to reign but never well enough to rule effectively. And the result was a vacuum at the center of French power that the great noble factions, particularly the houses of Orleans and Burgundy, rushed to fill with their own ambitions, their own armies, their own vendettas. The quarrel between Orleans and Burgundy became a civil war within the war. In 1407, the Duke of Orleans was assassinated on the orders of John the Fearless. Duke of Burgundy, murdered in a Paris street, cut down in the dark. The Orleanists, who came to be called the Armagnacs, did not forgive this. The two factions fought each other with a bitterness that made the English enemy seem almost secondary. And it was into this divided France that Henry V of England arrived in 1415 with an army and a revived claim to the French throne and a strategic clarity that the situation seemed almost designed to reward. Henry V. He is one of those historical figures who seems, even at this distance, to have been made of something slightly different from ordinary human material, not better, exactly, not more admirable in every sense, but more intensely himself, more completely present in every account that survives of him. He was spare and hard, with a long, angular face and dark eyes that his contemporaries found unsettling in their directness. He had spent his youth in genuine military campaigning in Wales and along the Welsh border, putting down the rebellion of Owain Glyndwr. And he had come out of that experience with a soldier's understanding of logistics and discipline and the actual unglamorous mechanics of keeping an army in the field. He was also, by all evidence, deeply and personally religious, not performatively pious in the manner of medieval kings who used religion as theater, but genuinely convinced that his cause was God's cause, and that the discipline and righteousness of his army were not merely military virtues but theological ones. He sailed for France in August of 1415 with an army of perhaps 12,000 men. He besieged and captured Harfla at the mouth of the Seine, a siege that cost him a significant portion of his army to disease, and then, rather than sail home as good sense might have suggested, he marched north toward Calais with a depleted force moving through hostile country in deteriorating October weather, harassed by a French army that was tracking him and growing. The two forces met near a small village called Agincourt on the 25th of October, 1415, the feast of Saints Crispin and Crispian, a date that would ring down through the centuries in the memory of England. The French army outnumbered the English by at least 3-1, possibly more. The French knights had been waiting for this moment, for the chance to prove, against all the evidence of Crécy and Poitiers, that the proper order of the world had been only temporarily disrupted and would now be restored. The field of Agincourt was long and narrow, flanked by woodland on both sides, freshly plowed and sodden from recent rain. The French deployed in massed formations, knights and men-at-arms so packed together that those in the rear could barely move, their armor heavy with morning dew, their horses nervous and sliding in the churned mud. Henry arranged his archers along the wings, drove sharpened stakes into the ground before them to break a cavalry charge, and then waited. When neither side moved for a time, he ordered his army to advance, to march slowly forward across the field until they were within extreme longbow range, and then to stop and loose. The French, provoked or perhaps simply unable to hold their restless cavalry any longer, charged. The archers drew and loosed, in the rhythm that years of practice had made as natural as breathing. 5 times a minute, thousands of arrows per minute, and the charge dissolved into a chaos of falling horses and screaming men and knights buried face down in the mud under the weight of their own armor, unable to rise. The English men-at-arms waded in with mallet and blade. The killing went on for a long time. The French dead numbered in the thousands. The exact figure is uncertain and was contested even at the time, and among them were some of the greatest noble houses of France. Their names a roll call of the medieval chivalric world. The English dead, by most accounts, numbered in the hundreds. When it was over and the field was counted, Henry returned to Calais and then to England and was received there with celebrations of an intensity that the chroniclers struggled to describe, as though the nation itself had needed this proof of something, of its king's legitimacy, of God's favor, of the justice of its ancient claim. The consequences of Agincourt unfolded over the years that followed with a speed that must have seemed, to those who lived through it, like inevitability. The Burgundians, nursing their grievance against the Armagnacs for the murder of John the Fearless, who was himself assassinated in 1419, on a bridge at Montereau, in a killing that may have had the young Dauphin's connivance, allied themselves with England. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 disinherited the Dauphin, the future Charles VII, and declared Henry V heir to the French throne and regent of France during the madness of Charles VI. Henry married Catherine, the French king's daughter, a marriage that was both political transaction and, by the accounts that survive, something genuinely personal, something that Henry at least appeared to find meaningful. He was in France, preparing the next campaign, when he fell ill in the summer of 1422. He died at Vincennes in August of that year, at 35 years of age, having conquered half of France and stood on the verge of uniting both kingdoms under his crown. He had never quite finished anything. 2 months later, Charles VI of France died, the Mad King, the Glass King, the king who had reigned for 42 years and governed for almost none of them. His death left 2 men claiming the French throne. The infant Henry VI of England, 9 months old, who had inherited both his father's claim and his grandfather's kingdom, and the disinherited Dauphin, Charles, 20 years old, retreating southward, controlling only those parts of France that had not yet fallen to the Anglo-Burgundian alliance, uncertain of his own legitimacy and the legitimacy of his cause. It must have seemed, in 1422, that the war was effectively over and England had won. The English controlled Paris and Normandy and most of northern France. The Burgundians controlled the rich territories of the northeast. Charles the Dauphin held the south and west but seemed to lack both the resources and the will to mount a serious challenge. Let your breathing slow now. The river is very dark, and the stars very bright, and the barge with its single lantern has passed around the bend and is gone, its light absorbed back into the darkness of the water. The willows are barely visible now, dark shapes, breathing softly in the night wind, their reflections broken and reformed with each slight ripple. The heron is gone too, lifted away at some point in the last few minutes without any sound, a ghost departing a place it had chosen to inhabit for an evening and then chose to leave. The world is very quiet. The France of 1422 was not quiet. It was full of the sounds of occupation and resistance, of soldiers quartered in farmhouses and monks still chanting in abbeys and peasants going about the business of surviving in a country that had been fought over for nearly a century. Let those sounds settle into the distance now. Let the river do its ancient, patient work. The war was not over. It would never be as simple as that. In the country around Orleans, in the borderlands between English-controlled France and the Dauphin's territories, the fighting continued in the grinding, unglamorous way that most medieval warfare actually proceeded. Not in the great set-piece battles that the chronicles remembered and the historians studied, but in raids and counter-raids, in the burning of villages and the destruction of harvests, in the taking and losing and retaking of castles and fortified towns, whose names meant nothing to anyone not born within 20 miles of them, in the deaths of people who left no record of their names or their courage or their suffering. This was the war as most people who lived through it experienced it. Not Crécy or Agincourt, but the sound of horsemen in the night, the smell of smoke, the long grinding anxiety of occupation. And then, in 1428, the English besieged Orleans. Orleans sat on the Loire, the great river that divided northern France from the south, and it was the key to the Dauphin's remaining territories. If Orleans fell, Charles would lose not only a city but the strategic position that made further resistance conceivable. The siege went on through the autumn and into the winter, and it seemed, to those who watched it, like the final act, the English drawing the noose tight, the Dauphin unable to relieve the city, the garrison holding on through sheer stubbornness but with no reason to expect salvation. The salvation came from an unexpected direction. In the village of Domremy, in Lorraine, on the eastern edge of the Dauphin's territory, a girl named Jehanne had been hearing voices since she was about 13 years old, the voices of St. Michael and St. Catherine and St. Margaret, speaking to her in the light, telling her that she had been chosen by God to drive the English from France and lead the Dauphin to his proper coronation at Reims. She was the daughter of a farmer, illiterate, about 17 years old. She had never been to war. She had, as far as anyone could determine, no particular reason to be taken seriously by anyone. And yet she was so absolutely certain of what she had been told, so completely without doubt or hesitation in her conviction, that when she finally made her way to the Dauphin's court at Chinon in February of 1429 and stood before Charles, who had arranged a small deception to test her, mingling with his courtiers rather than sitting on his throne. She identified him immediately and told him things that she could not have known, and convinced him that she was what she said she was. What she said she was an instrument of God, not a prophet in the sense of someone who predicted the future, not a mystic in the sense of someone withdrawn from the world, but a soldier, a leader, someone who would ride into battle in white armor with a standard painted with the image of God and the names of Jesus and Mary. Someone who would stand at the front of the assault and move through arrow fire with a composure that her contemporaries found inexplicable, as though the arrows were not meant for her, as though she existed in some slightly different version of the physical world where the usual rules did not apply. She was wounded several times, an arrow through the shoulder at Orleans, a crossbow bolt to the leg before Paris, and each time she pulled herself together and went back. She did not seem afraid. Or if she was afraid, she was more afraid of failing God than of anything an English archer could do to her. She reached Orleans in April of 1429, leading a relief column that brought supplies and soldiers into the besieged city. And within days she had galvanized the demoralized garrison into an attack on the English siege works that took the besiegers entirely by surprise. She fought at the head of the assault, her banner always visible, her voice carrying above the noise of battle. The English held bastions fell, one by one, over the course of several days. By the 8th of May, the siege was lifted. Orleans was free. It had taken Jehanne, who would become in history and in legend Jeanne d'Arc. Joan of Arc, less than 2 weeks in the field to accomplish what Charles's best commanders had been unable to do in 7 months. The French army that followed her now believed something that armies very rarely believe: that God was specifically, personally, operationally on their side. This belief is not a small thing in the conduct of war. It changes the calculation of risk. It changes the threshold of courage. An ordinary soldier who advances across open ground into arrow fire is making a calculation about probability and survival and the value of the objective. A soldier who believes he is fighting in the army of God is making a different kind of calculation. Or perhaps no calculation at all. And that difference in behavior, multiplied across thousands of men, is a genuine military advantage. The French forces that swept through the Loire Valley in the summer of 1429 did so with a momentum and aggression that the English commanders could not fully account for by any rational military analysis. They fell back. Towns surrendered without siege. the road to Reims opened. The coronation of Charles VII at Reims Cathedral on the 17th of July, 1429, was the fulfillment of everything Joan had said she would accomplish. Reims was the ancient coronation city of the French kings. It was here, in this great Gothic cathedral whose construction had begun in the early 13th century, and whose interior was an education in what stone could be made to do when human beings gave it their best, that the kings of France were anointed with the sacred oil, said to have been brought from heaven by a dove at the baptism of Clovis, the first Christian king of France. Charles had been a dauphin, a prince, claimant, a man of uncertain legitimacy, until the moment the Archbishop of Reims anointed him and placed the crown on his head. After that moment, he was the consecrated King of France. And everything that opposed him opposed not merely a political claim but a divine appointment. Joan stood near him during the ceremony, her standard held upright, and the accounts of those who were present suggest that she wept. Her story did not end happily. In the months after the coronation, as Charles's court settled into the more conventional rhythms of diplomacy and negotiation, Joan's role became more ambiguous. She was still fighting. She remained convinced that the war had to continue until all English forces were expelled from France, but she was no longer the talismanic figure of the Loire campaign, the almost miraculous embodiment of divine favor. She was a difficult person to manage, too certain of her own guidance, too insistent that the voices she heard should take precedence over the strategic judgments of commanders and counselors who had very different ideas about how to proceed. In May of 1430, she was captured near Compiègne during a skirmish, captured by Burgundian forces and sold to the English, who understood very clearly what having her as a prisoner meant and what needed to be done with her. The trial that followed is one of the most carefully documented events of the medieval period, because both sides understood its significance and both sides kept records. She was tried for heresy by an ecclesiastical court at Rouen, in English-controlled Normandy, before judges who were French in nationality but aligned politically with the English cause. The charges centered on her wearing of male clothing, which was condemned as contrary to divine law, and on her claim to receive direct revelation from God, which threatened the Church's authority to mediate between the human and the divine. She was interrogated on many occasions, without legal counsel, and her responses show someone of quite remarkable intelligence and spiritual steadiness operating under extraordinary pressure. She was confused about some things and sharp about others. She was, in the end, found guilty of heresy and relapsed heresy, and on the 30th of May, 1431, she was burned at the stake in the marketplace at Rouen. She was about 19 years old. She asked for a cross to look at while she burned, and an English soldier made her one from 2 sticks, and she held it and looked at it until she could look at nothing anymore. Those who were there, who had come to witness the execution of a witch, of a heretic, of a dangerous fraud, left the marketplace in silence. The executioner later said that he had been afraid for his soul. The secretary to the King of England wrote that they had burned a saint. 25 years after her execution, the church that had condemned her reopened her case at the request of Charles VII, reviewed the evidence, reversed the verdict, and declared her innocent of all charges. In 1920, the same church canonized her. She is the patron saint of France. The war continued for another 22 years after Joan's death, moving now toward its conclusion not through the dramatic gestures of battle and coronation, but through the slower mechanics of alliance and diplomacy and the gradual exhaustion of English power in France. The great turning point came in 1435, when the Duke of Burgundy made peace with Charles VII at the Congress of Arras and withdrew from the English alliance. Burgundy's defection changed everything. Without Burgundian support, the English position in northern France became increasingly untenable. They controlled Paris and Normandy but could not govern effectively, could not suppress the resistance movements that proliferated in the countryside, could not move forces from one place to another without harassment and loss. Paris was retaken by the French in 1436. Normandy fell in 1450 at the Battle of Formigny, where a French force equipped with artillery, the new weapon, the weapon that was changing everything, that had already made the castle walls and the armored knight begin to look like expensive anachronisms, destroyed an English army that was fighting in the familiar way, with archers deployed on a ridge, as though it were still Agincourt. The cannon. It is necessary to pause on the cannon, because it is part of what this long war produced, or rather, what it accelerated, what it normalized. Gunpowder had been known in Europe since the mid-13th century, and primitive cannon had appeared on European battlefields since the early 14th. But they were, for most of the first century of the war, supplementary weapons, noisy, unreliable, more useful for terrifying horses than for breaching walls or killing men. Over the course of the war, and particularly in the 1430s and 40s, they improved. They became larger and more reliable. They could hurl stone balls, and then iron balls, with sufficient force to shatter the masonry of castle walls that had been considered impregnable for 200 years. The war that had begun partly because of a question of feudal obligation and hereditary claim was ending partly because a new technology had changed the relationship between offense and defense, between the mounted knight and the garrison commander, between the old ways and whatever was coming next. The medieval world was not ended by the 100 Years' War, but the 100 Years' War helped to hollow it out from the inside. Gascony, the heart of Aquitaine, the ancient English territory in the southwest, fell last. The English had held it, in one form or another, for 3 centuries, and the Gascons themselves had mixed feelings about the change. They had prospered under English rule, had enjoyed trading privileges and a degree of self-governance, and the transition to French sovereignty brought disruption they had not necessarily sought. The final English army in France was destroyed at the Battle of Castillon in 1453, the last pitched battle of the war, fought near the town of Castillon-la-Bataille on a summer afternoon in Gascony, where French artillery again proved decisive, where the English forces were cut down not by arrows this time but by cannonballs, where the commander John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, an old man by then, one of the last great English commanders of the war, a figure so fearsome that French mothers had used his name to frighten children, was killed trying to lead a charge that had no hope of succeeding. He was in his 80s. He had been fighting this war for most of his life. After Castillon, England held nothing in France but Calais. The war did not formally end. There was no peace treaty, no document signed and sealed and exchanged between the two kingdoms. It simply stopped, like a fever that breaks in the night, leaving the patient weak and disoriented but alive. England kept Calais until 1558, when it too was taken by the French, and Queen Mary of England, who had married the King of Spain and had hoped for Spanish help in recovering it, said, on hearing the news, that when she died, Calais would be found written on her heart. What had the war done in its 116 years? It had killed, directly and indirectly, enormous numbers of people, soldiers and peasants and townspeople, the dead of the great pitched battles and the dead of the sieges and the dead of the famines that followed the destruction of harvests and the disruption of agriculture. It had layered atrocity onto atrocity in the French countryside until the accumulated suffering of the peasantry had hardened into something almost geological, a layer of grief and anger deposited across generations. It had produced, in its later stages and partly in response to the humiliations of English occupation, a French national consciousness that had not existed in anything like the same form at the war's beginning. A sense that France was not merely a collection of feudal territories held together by the person of the king, but a people,
Un pays,
a something worth fighting for that transcended the accidents of royal inheritance. Joan of Arc was both a product of this emerging consciousness and one of its primary architects. She spoke of France, not merely of the Dauphin. She imagined it as a thing with a soul. England, too, was changed. The loss of France, of the territories that English kings had held and fought for since the Norman conquest, the loss of the dream of a dual monarchy that Henry V had seemed on the verge of realizing, was a wound to the English political psyche that contributed directly to the instability of the reign of Henry VI, to the breakdown of aristocratic political culture, to the Wars of the Roses that began even before the last battle in France and consumed English political life for decades afterward. England turned inward, turned, eventually, toward the sea. The long engagement with France, the dream of continental empire, slowly gave way to other dreams of trade, of exploration, of an island identity that did not require possession of the European mainland. History does not move in straight lines, and the connection between any cause and its distant effects is always partial and tentative. But it is not wrong to say that the end of the 100 Years' War was one of the moments in which England began, slowly and without knowing it, to become a different kind of country. The night is deep now, and the river is invisible below its dark surface, moving with its old patience toward the sea. The willows are asleep. The fields beyond them are asleep. The great green fields of northern France, the land over which the armies marched and the peasants rebuilt and the churches went on conducting their ancient business of prayer and burial and the marking of time. Those fields look, in most respects, as they have always looked, the same shape, roughly, the same curve of the land, the same quality of light in the morning when the mist lies in the low places and the larks begin their vertical ascent above the wheat. The battles are gone from this land, absorbed into it the way old iron absorbs into old soil, becoming indistinguishable at some depth from the earth itself. Think of the ordinary people who lived through this. The farmers of Normandy who saw English armies march through their fields in 1346 and French armies reclaim them in 1450 and understood that the world operated on a scale they could not control, and who planted their grain anyway, in the knowledge that the harvest, if it came, would be theirs, at least until someone came and took it. The mothers in the Gascon towns who raised their children in a place that had been English for 300 years and that would be French tomorrow, who told their children the old stories and cooked the old food and prayed in the old way regardless of whose flag flew over the citadel. The knights on both sides who had grown up on the literature of chivalry, the romances of Arthur and Lancelot, of Roland and Oliver, who tried to conduct themselves in accordance with an ideal they knew was partly fiction but that gave form to their lives anyway, who fought fiercely and sometimes killed cruelly and also, sometimes, performed acts of genuine courtesy and restraint. The scribes who wrote everything down. The monks who copied the chronicles by candlelight in their monasteries. The women who never appear in the chronicles at all, who are present only in their absence, who cooked and nursed and mourned and rebuilt and kept the thread of daily life intact through all of it. Let the thought of them rest gently. They lived their whole lives, which were, in most respects, full lives, full of the ordinary textures of existence, inside this enormous event that history would one day compress into a phrase, into a name, into a period with a beginning date and an end date, as though it had been experienced as a single thing rather than as a succession of days, each day complete in itself, each day containing its own weather and its own meals and its own conversations and its own small moments of beauty. The world is always larger than any name we give it. The people who live inside history experience it as life, not as history, and that is both the limitation and the gift of being a creature in time. Somewhere across the fields, a church tower holds a bell that has been ringing the hours in this country since the 15th century. It rings now, faintly, twice, a sound that travels over the dark fields and across the river and dissolves into the enormous quietness of the night. 2 in the morning, the very deep of it, the hour when the world has given itself over entirely to sleep, and the only things awake are the owls and the foxes and whatever it is in a human being that sometimes opens its eyes in the darkness and wonders at the fact of being alive, at the improbability of it, at the strange fortune of existing in this particular body, in this particular moment of an old and busy and endlessly surprising world. Let yourself sink now into the deep of this night. The war is over, all the wars, for tonight, finished and settled and laid down in the earth. The great pitched battles have become names in books, and the names in the books have become quieter with each passing year. And the earth over which the armies marched has grown its grass back and its crops and its orderly rows of vines. And the rivers have continued their slow business of carrying the rain to the sea. And the larks have sung above the wheat in every June since 1453 without a single pause in their singing. Let that continuity be a comfort. The world that made those people and was made by them and outlasted them is still making people, still being made, still outlasting everyone with its patient abundance. The breathing slows, the body settles, the river is moving in the darkness below, carrying its old cargo of reflected stars, its surface just barely luminous in the moonless night. Its sound the oldest sound in this landscape, older than the war, older than France or England as ideas, older than the names we have for anything. Just water moving over stone. Just the patient delivery of everything downstream to everything further downstream. In an order that was established long before any of this began, and that will continue long after everything we call the present has become the past and the past has become the earth. Sleep comes the way the night came, not all at once, but in layers, each one softer and deeper than the last, each one carrying you a little further from the world of names and dates and battles and the anxious work of being awake. The willows are sleeping. The fields are sleeping. The bells have stopped. The heron is somewhere in the dark, standing in the shallows of the river, motionless as a thought held in the mind just before sleep takes it away. Sleep now. The river holds the stars.